This is American Government, Monday, October 19th, 2020. We're going to finish up with our discussion of the party system and turn on Wednesday to the presidency. I've sent the PRQs out, and again, the first thing we'll do is turn to Hamilton, Federalist 70 and 71 through 74, as it turns out, Nichols Reader, which is a defense and explanation of the presidency in the original Constitution. So today we'll discuss mostly the question of reforming the two-party system. Again, remember, Diamond argues in his essay on the Electoral College, as we pointed out, that the abolishing the Electoral College would be likely to weaken, if not undermine and destroy the two-party system. So the question arises, what's the value of a two-party system? And following Caesar's essay on parties and constitutional principle in the Nichols Reader, which essentially echoes the same narrative that the Wilson chapter on political parties did, let's recall a couple of fundamental facts and developments from that essay. Our two-party system is essentially the result of Martin Van Buren's reform of the party system and the electoral college system in the 1820s and 30s. Caesar points this out, Wilson points this out. Why is Martin Van Buren the founding father of the two-party system? Because his idea was to create two stable, moderate, popular parties, which would channel candidates' ambition into generate a following among state and local party organizations and leaders, since it's on that level that the race for the presidency under the Electoral College would be organized. And that would prevent ambitious candidates from crafting a following by employing demagogic appeals, such as image appeals, where a candidate would simply convey a popular image of himself or use demagogic and image appeals to denigrate his opponents or her opponents, or issue arousals of using issues to generate a following. By organizing the electorate into two stable, moderate parties, the two-party system would also prevent destructive divisions and energies from turning the presidential election into a civil war every 4 years. The two parties create nominating structures, the national conventions that date back to that time, that generate two candidates who then compete for the people's popular vote through the Electoral College. And that still describes in some ways the system that we have today. Of course, you'll see that we'll now discuss the primary reforms and changes to that, which have really created a new party system in the last 40 to 50 years. Now, the reason people are often not aware that there's a new party system, the era of modern reform and since that Caesar talks about and that Wilson talks about, is because, like the Electoral College, where everything is still described by the original constitutional language, but the system operates quite differently from what the framers intended, you're going to see that that the system that Van Buren created and developed with two broad parties competing for the electorate, producing two candidates under national nominating conventions. Those structures still exist, but they operate very differently now. Really, we have a different party system, even though the structure still exists. It's quite parallel to the Electoral College. So the major changes in that two-party system that Van Buren created, and Caesar's point again, is that even though the framers didn't want political parties and anticipated that it would not be a useful addition to the system, by Van Buren's time, that Van Buren's goals overlapped with, if not were identical to, but at least were overlapped with the framers, especially with respect to containing candidate ambition and the effect on the overall political system and the electorate. So it was really the progressives at the turn of the century, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and the era of modern reform, which both Caesar and Wilson date to about 1968. Actually, there's a point, a historical point and event, which both discuss, and we'll talk about them, which brought into being our contemporary party system. The main modifications to this Van Buren two-party system were the democratizing reforms of the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. And their essential institutional creation of the primary election, the first election in the electoral season, um, and the spread and dominance of parties by the modern reformers after the Democratic National Convention of 1968, which then led in the Democratic Party to the McGovern Party, the McGovern Commission reform, which then recommended essentially two kinds of reforms. Now, let me back up. The progressives created the primary election so as to take the nomination of especially presidential candidates away from party leaders and organizations and give it to the people, where a candidate would have to create popular followings within each party in order to get that party's nominations. But the progressives were not successful in creating a system dominated by that mechanism. Up until the 1950s and 60s, only about 6 to 12 states that depended on the presidential election even held primary elections, which is to say, was the state party organizations and conventions in their state conventions that would nominate delegates to the national convention. So the major change that the McGovern, and let me just also say, by the way, that the results of primaries up through the 1950s and 60s of the 6 to 12 states that even had them were just as kind of like public opinion polls, just to test a candidate's popular strength. The real nomination, of course, was made by the party delegates and organizations that chose the delegates to the national convention, and that's where the nomination of the presidency of the presidential candidates for each party really occurred. The first television conventions in the 1952, I think, was the first televised convention. Up until 1968 were actually dramatic affairs because you really didn't know necessarily who the nominee was going to be, because the conventions actually did nominating. As we're going to see, what the McGovern Commission did as a result of the riots at the time of the Democratic Convention, where the peace candidates, because of the Vietnam War and the protests against it, where those delegates were sort of shut out because they didn't go, those candidates who appealed, like Eugene McCarthy or Robert Kennedy, who was then assassinated, of course, by Sirhan Sirhan during the summer of 1968. But George McGovern, the peace candidates, essentially didn't have any delegates, and therefore, when people protested, this is actually what happened, and I remember seeing this on television in 1968. Then Mayor Daley, who was one of the traditional party bosses in the Democratic Party, sicked the police, and there were brutal riots and everything like that, a kind of an unpleasant affair. And so to prevent that kind of mess, the Democratic Party, under the McGovern Commission, reformed itself. And the two primary reforms, two major reforms, let me keep that word separate, were to, one, now require all states to have some kind of popular nominating system where candidates for the presidency would have to start with primary elections or caucuses, which are slightly more focused, party organized means of selecting delegates, but nevertheless all essentially popular input, where all states would have to do some version of it. And 41 states do some kind of primary, and about 9 states do caucuses, like like Iowa. The other reform was to make the result of the primaries binding on the delegates to the national convention. And you're going to see a kind of a parallel development, I'll come back to this, occurred, where because of the rise of parties and the winner-take-all system, the Electoral College still technically elects the president, but it's really the people in each state, as Diamond points out, that actually elect the president. So the election shifted from the Electoral College to the people, even though it's still technically the same. And you'll see in the same way in the nomination stage, the nomination moved from the conventions to the people. So we now have both a popular form of electing the president and a popular form of nominating the president. That's where we're going with these comments. So first, the Democratic Party adopted these reforms, and they quickly spread. And then in the early 70s and mid 70s, by that time, the Republican Party had adopted this system. So essentially, we had a new form of nominating the president, and of course, this affected other races like senatorial and congressional races too. So there were a couple of other recent developments in campaigns and elections that affected this. I just want to talk briefly about these. And the major one was a spate of campaign and finance reform legislation, which was passed in the early 70s. The the Federal Elections Campaign Act of 1971, amended by 74, and was somewhat importantly amended in the early 2000s, 2002. This reform limited the role of parties in financing and running campaigns, because prior to the campaign finance reform, the parties were the primary source of candidate support and managed the campaigns. Because the campaign finance limitation put severe limitations on what parties could contribute and what individuals could contribute and what other groups could contribute, and also put, by the way, spending limitations. But the Supreme Court in 1974 held that candidates, you could not constitutionally limit the money that candidates and campaigns spent, because that was a form of spending money as a form of political speech under the First Amendment. That decision was controversial. It was reinforced in 2010 in Citizens United, and that's a controversial issue in our politics today. But it upheld the idea that you could have contribution limits. So as a result, PACs, political action committees, which are like individual issue-oriented or interest-oriented campaign raising committees, spread because even though they're limited in the amount they can give to a candidate, the number that they exist isn't limited, and they've proliferated, and to the extent to which they're now about 49 to 50% of all campaign financing. It means, in other words, that candidates, rather than having their contributions being filtered through a party organization, although the parties are still active both in the congressional and the national level, essentially candidates now have to go directly to the special interest to fund their campaigns. It's created a kind of a more intimate connection between campaigns, candidates, and special interests. Also, one has to say that for reasons we'll see in a minute, that television and television advertising, and then the rise of the internet and social media became dominant forms of political information. So the electorate was less dependent upon parties for shaping candidate images, etc., more dependent on the media, and to some degree, especially with social media in the late 1900s and the early 2000s, once social media became prominent, there's a certain even greater reduced role of parties in shaping elections and campaigns. And as a result, our campaigns, both on the presidential election level and on the congressional and local election, we essentially have candidate funded and candidate managed campaigns. The first thing, if you're a candidate, you have to hire a campaign staff who will then manage your campaign and do fundraising. And that's one of the reasons, to go back to Congress, why some people argue incumbency is so intense, because now we force members of Congress also to essentially run their own campaigns and raise their own money through PACs and special interests. So that may have helped to increase incumbency. So as a result, our present party system really only goes back to the 1970s. And the results of all these reforms, especially the era of modern reform with the spread of binding primaries in presidential campaigns and the other kinds of campaign reforms, our presidential and our congressional and other nomination and election contests are now completely popular and democratic. As a result, we have more demagogic kinds of candidate appeals, where candidates now have to generate a completely popular following within each party as they vie for the nomination. The candidates and the campaigns and contests have become longer, beginning early, because each candidate now has to generate his or her own popular following, so they have to start earlier. Excuse me. And they are more expensive because they're more media dominated. It's a joke almost that the next presidential election starts immediately after the end of each presidential election, but there's truth to that. As a result, our campaigns have become more negative and more polarized, and our parties have become more polarized. And in some ways, also, there's been absolutely no restraint on the number of initial candidates. So, so as a result, in 2016, there were 19 original Republican candidates, and in 2020, starting off in the nomination stage last year, with the campaigns and the caucuses, there were originally 23 Democrats. And so, in some ways, you also have to remember that one of the effects of turning the nomination to a completely a popular form of process is that in primary elections, which has some of the lowest turnout in American elections, also it tends to be the most extreme members of each party who vote in primary elections. So we have a situation in which the nomination stage produces more polarized and more extreme candidates because in order to get the nomination, you have to appeal to that more extreme base. Whereas in the general election, you find people now having to run to the middle and kind of you're forcing candidates to be extreme and polarized on the nomination stage and more moderate and centrist on the uh, in the general election. I think both Donald Trump and to some degree and Joe Biden have experienced that tension. So we come to the question: is the two-party a good system thing? It should be replaced, and what would it be replaced by? Would that thing be better than what we have? Let me remind you of something that we talked about when we first talked about the parties and the question of elections. People vote according to three criteria: party labels, although that seems to be diminishing uh, uh, with the rise of more independent voting, as we talked about last week. Um, they tend to vote on issue, although relatively few voters are single issue voters, but many are, whether it's abortion or the environment or global warming or the economy or whatever, or candidate. You'll notice that our presidential election in 2020 has become very intense and personal, revolving around the personal qualities of both